My name is Alfred Daniel Gates, and there's a long story behind that too. And I served in the Army in World War II, Army Signal Corps, and in the Korean incident I was in the United States Air Force as an air police officer. And there's a long story behind that too. When they bombed Pearl Harbor, I was at Washington High School, and at that time I think I was a junior. No, I was a sophomore. When I was in the third grade, we lived in Wayne Township and went to Ben Davis Grade School, and I had scarlet fever. So I was quarantined for 3 weeks. My dad had to change clothes out in the garage in order to work. And when he'd finish work, he'd come back and change clothes to come in the house. The place we lived in there had electricity. That's it. No water, gas. The only utility we had was electricity. Well, anyway, I was sick. And my dad, when he came home from work, he said, "Good night." And the quarantine was up, but so he drove down to the corner drugstore, called the doctor and said, "My boy is sick. You gotta come and see him." The doctor said, "Well, bring him to my office tomorrow and I'll have a look at him." And Pop said, "You come to my house now or I'm coming after you with a shotgun." And he meant it. So the doctor came out and said, "Good grief, that boy is sick. You get him to a hospital." They bundled me up, took me to Riley Hospital, and they admitted me into an oxygen room. Not just a tent, the whole room. Anyway, I spent 9 weeks and 4 days at Riley Hospital. They ended up with a diagnosis that I had an enlarged heart as a result of this double pneumonia, they call it, and a near mastoid in my ears. Well, with an enlarged heart diagnosis, I wasn't allowed to do anything. I could walk to school, but that was it. Well, when I got to the 5th grade, we moved from Ben Davis into Indianapolis, into Hallville, out on the west side. And I was in the 5th grade. And because Ben Davis was a little bit ahead of Indianapolis as far as the school was concerned, I was able to make up that half a year in 5 weeks. So I got back onto the regular schedule. It was a really neat thing, but one of my buddies that I played with there in the neighborhood was a Boy Scout. And he said, "Alfred, why don't you come and join the Boy Scouts with me?" And so I did. It was sponsored by the West Michigan Street Methodist Church. And I really tacked on to the scouting program and activities and everything. Eventually became an Eagle Scout. There's a lot of things in scouting, but I didn't accomplish squat in sports. When I was taking gym at Washington High School as a freshman there, I was the last kid chosen anytime they did anything. And in my freshman and sophomore years were both the same. They were miserable for me. And then I found out I could take ROTC instead of gym. So I signed up for junior ROTC, and I clicked with that. And ended up, by the time I got to be a senior, I was the battalion adjutant as a cadet major in ROTC. And of course, I was had been all different things from assistant patrol leader up to junior assistant scoutmaster in my scout troop. So I was quite qualified there. And I took a test when I was a senior at Washington. And at the top of the form, it said Army or Navy. And I wasn't a strong swimmer, so I checked Army. And then after I graduated, I had been working part-time at Sears Roebuck's, and so I went to work full-time there at Sears. And no, I was still working part-time at Sears. And my mother said, "Did you read that letter close?" I got a letter from the Army, said, "Report to the Armory there on Pennsylvania Street for a physical to see if you qualify to be in the Army." Mom said, "Did you read that letter close?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It said bring a suitcase with 2 weeks worth of clothes." I reread the letter, and sure enough, that's what it said. I went down to the Armory, my appointment on 4th of August, 1943, and I passed the physical, and they swore me into the Army Reserves. I was still 17 years old. And sure enough, they put me on a bus and sent me down to the University of Kentucky in Lexington. And I spent 3 months down there on a quarterly basis. It equated to 35 hours, 35 college hours. And I got through that, but I turned 18. And well, while I was there, I became the company commander for the ROTC. And I could hitchhike home with my ROTC uniform on, because in 1943, soldiers were picked up and nobody messed with us. At least I never got messed with. Anyway, I could hitchhike home from Lexington through Louisville quicker than I could take a bus or anything short of flying, and there's no way I could do that. And there's some wild stories about hitchhiking home from there. Well, anyway, I turned 18, and during my quarter that I spent down there at the UK, and in November then I came home, and I had all the required merit badges for Eagle, and they called a special board of review, and so I passed it for my Eagle Scout and became qualified as an Eagle. And fortunately, since they put me on active duty in the Army and sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia, for Army Specialized Training, basic training. It was a special basic training class down there. And my Eagle Scout Award was presented in January at a special court of honor for all the Eagle Scouts. And my mother picked up my badge, my award, and mailed it to me at Fort Benning, Georgia. Well, to get back to Fort Benning, I reported down there for this special basic training for the Army Specialized Training Program. And it was halfway between infantry basic and infantry OCS, because in the specialized training program we were scheduled to go back to college and get a degree in whatever, engineering, whatever the Army needed. Well, anyway, And week 9 of this special basic training, they decided that they needed us more on the regular Army than going to school. They dropped 35,000 from the specialized training program, including all of us that were in basic training. And there were 35 of us that they assigned to the 23rd Signal Construction Battalion. You know, good grief. What in the world would the Signal Corps build? And we got together, and we're all 18 to 18 and a half years old. What in the world would the Signal Corps build? Must be pigeon coops. Well, anyway, it wasn't. But I asked him, I said, the people that were running things, I said, what the dickens is going on here? I mean, I'm doing well in the infantry. I've done some neat things. I mean, why did you put me in the Signal Corps? He said, well, because you had bad teeth. My teeth were all rotted out between each one. I said, I'm not going to bite anybody. So, but you know, you don't argue with the Army. And I became a Signal Corps person, and I got to be a PFC, climbing poles, and they sent me to Camp Pickett, Virginia for the Signal Corps basic training, which included becoming a telephone lineman. And they'd gone up into the woods and cut a bunch of pine trees and made poles, 35-foot poles that we trained on. Well, I go to the top of the pole and I cut out and burnt the pole. I mean, whoosh, down. Fortunately, I had on leggings and leather gauntlet gloves, and I rode the pole down. Now the guys that, I wasn't the only one that did that, you know, climbed the top of the pole and then cut out. Some of them grabbed the pole, well, that put splinters all up and down them. I was fortunate, I rode the pole down with those leather gauntlet gloves. Took my hooks off, and the sergeant said, okay, we'll grunt the rest of it. So the next session that we had, I get up, climb up the pole, burnt then. I did it 3 times. Finally, the sergeant said, Gates, you got to keep your hind end away from the pole. You got to maintain an angle with the hooks into that wood so it'll stay. So, why didn't you tell me that before? You know. Well, anyway, you don't argue with sergeant. And, I got to the point where I could climb the poles and keep my hind end out to keep the right angle. But I never was comfortable working on a pole. When I was working on the 1 pin or the 10 pin, I was almost horizontal to the ground. And anytime I got over head high on a pair of hooks, I was not comfortable. And it was a lot of long stories. But I ended up in Burma. And we didn't use pine trees for poles in Burma. When they built I was on the Burma Road, the Lido Road, from Lido, India to Kunming, China. And there are a lot of long stories to get to that point. But anyway, when they first built the telephone line, and the 96th Signal Construction Battalion built that telephone line, when they first built it, they were cutting trees in the jungles of north central Burma and float them down the Irrawaddy River. Well, they'd skin them down and make poles out of them, and then float them down the Irrawaddy River and then built the telephone lines. About 3 months and fall down. The bottoms would rot out because the moisture and insects. Good night, this is not going to work. You know, we've got to have telephone lines. And so they decided that since the jungles of north central Burma had a lot of teak wood, they'd try cutting teak wood trees. Well, they had to cut 2 regular trees and 1 teak wood tree and make poles out of them and lash them together, because teak wood will not float. It's too dense. And they'd float those 3 then down to where they were building the telephone lines and use the 2 regular trees for the natives to build houses with or whatever. And then they used the teak wood and made telephone poles out of teak wood. Well, by the time I got there, the line was all working, and I mean, it was completed. And your hooks would go in maybe a 1/16 of an inch, but that was plenty. I mean, there's no way it's going to cut out of a teak wood. That stuff is so dense. And but all of the telephone line poles for 1,200 miles were teak wood.